Hello, and welcome once again to the Herald of the Endtimes Apocalypse Hour. I'm your host, Ian Slutsky, the Grizzled Survivor, and we're back once again with Greg Marsh of VDoc.pro, our resident chemist friend here. And we've got a lot to talk about once again today. Pardon the background noise, we're in a coffee shop here like we were last week. Mr. Marsh, last time you were on, you talked a lot about quality control, and in our conversations we've had since then, you brought to light that you have a lot more to talk about quality control, and I'm just going to kind of hand it over to you. What other insights do you have about the process of quality control in the United States?
Well, last Wednesday we had another Rocky Flats Right to Know meeting here in Arvada, Colorado. You can find that on your map pretty easy. It's been around since 1870, and in 1952 the Atomic Energy Commission, led by Dr. Glenn Seaborg, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist in 1955, he was the first man to create matter that had never, ever previously existed anywhere in our universe, probably even the surface of the sun. Anyway, the Right to Know people are concerned about Rocky Flats and its chronic emissions because the cleanup of the site wasn't. It is surrounded by a number of pretty fancy, expensive homes. I call them size 10 homes on size 7 lots. You've seen them in many other cities in this country as well. Well, these places and their activities, mowing the grass, controlling prairie dogs and so forth, and other biological activity, disturb the plutonium left behind in the alleged cleanup. And in fact, if you go down very deep at all, you get into buried, ultra-toxic, ultra-radiated, ultra-radioactive things that were too dangerous to remove from the site, so they were buried. Well, normal biological activities, both animal and plant, tend to migrate these deadly plutonium particles to the surface, and then the wind, which can be 200 kilometers per hour over the site, can resuspend them and blow them right into Denver. Now, you won't be hearing about this from the Denver Chamber of Commerce. Ditto for the local Arvada Chamber of Commerce. They're not going to talk to you about this. The Department of Health, who should be taking some charge at least to monitor these insults, they will lie to you about the presence of plutonium that was not cleaned up until they're really pressured. Thumb screws work really well for that process. Anyway, under duress, they will admit, yeah, the site was not fully cleaned up, and they will put all these caveats in it as if it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. And the incidence of chronic disease is not good. And until recently, in fact, right across the street from where the Rocky Flats Right to Know people have their meetings in a church was in fact a major oncology clinic for people that did get cancer in the neighborhood, and it was there for decades. They've moved the facility probably closer to Rocky Flats. Now, what's happening is, at the meeting Wednesday night, the attorney, a very interested and unpaid, uncompensated attorney who's doing a very good job of bringing these deficiencies to the attention of the alleged regulatory bodies like the Colorado Department of Health. Actually, it's called the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment, which it is not. It's actually a politically driven bunch of nonsense on things that they really don't want to hear about, and this is one of them, as you guess. Well, I said to the lady, now, there was an outer perimeter fence that was designed to keep cattle from straying off the property if it was used on a farm with cattle. And this fence marked the outer perimeter zone, which was probably, I'll guess, about 500 meters from the worst contaminated part of the plant site, which is a small area that is still off limits to people out there wandering around in this new wildlife refuge. Well, this fence had the huge holes in it that were probably 20 centimeters by 15 centimeters or larger, and a plutonium particle that is capable of inflicting a cancer in a human being is typically around 1 nanometer in diameter, which means, I suppose, several billion of these particles could go through any one of those holes anytime it wanted if the wind was in the right direction. So the question came up, and I asked the attorney, I said, now let's say one of these particles is wafting off the plant, it comes to this fence before the cleanup and after the cleanup was allegedly underway and before the massive number of homes were built around the site. I said, now, let's say that this nano-sized particle of plutonium dioxide comes up to the fence, is not stopped because it's going through one of the gigantic holes in the fence, and it wafts, say, 1 millimeter off site. Now, what does this mean, and who's responsible for that particle and the damage it can do? Well, the problem is that the law is written, and this is not unique to Colorado. If you're in Fernald, if you're in Savannah River, if you're in the Nevada test site, Hanford, and on and on and on, you've got the same problem. It turns out that the Department of Energy owns that particle, and they're responsible for it. So the local health department uses that as an excuse not to quantify or monitor in any way how many of these particles are entering the local community and downwind as far as the Atlantic seaboard if you're in Colorado, or if the particle originates in Colorado. And the government, the local governments, are more or less exonerated by the powers that be, as corrupt as they are, in taking responsibility of even monitoring these. You know, how bad is it? How many of these particles are gone? Well, we're looking at renting a high-volume sampler for the purpose of quantifying what's actually coming off the site. And if we had a small amount of crowdfunding, we could probably do that, actually. Anyway, these particles waft off-site. They go whichever way the wind is blowing. And in most times, it's blowing from the website, the plant site down into the city of Denver. And you'd think more people would care. Well, they don't know. And I think they would care if they knew. But they don't have any numbers because nobody up there is doing any real monitoring for the things that people need to know if future generations for the next 239,950 more years will not be affected or will need to know what these effects are. That's the half-life of plutonium-239 times 10, which is considered the toxic life of a radionuclide. You take the half-life and multiply it by 10. And 239 has a half-life of about 24,000 years. Well, there's no registry for this. We would like to put together a registry with the data we find, with the cooperation of one or more local residents in the immediate area of Rocky Flats, and it could be even several kilometers away for that matter, and put this up on the internet for anyone who's interested to find out a truthful response. My firm has never had a contract there and never will, because they would never contact us even for a possible contract that we might serve them in the field of exposure science or environmental monitoring with the techniques of industrial hygiene and environmental chemistry.
I mean, it seems like if they had an industrial hygienist or an environmental scientist on site from the very beginning, they could have avoided a lot of these issues that arose after the plant's closure, such as the need to clean all this mess up because the mess wouldn't have been made in the first place.
Well, that's true, except that they had a number of my colleagues on the plant site, but being that they were basically corporate whores and they didn't want to lose their job, they never reported what they were required to report under the ethical standards of industrial hygiene, for example. And those standards really are not well defined, and they need a real good definition to protect the people that are supposed to be protected by their expertise and knowledge. It goes, well, I was going to say it goes without saying, but perhaps not. When big corporations like Dow Chemical, who were the first operators of the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant and many other horrible messes which have not been cleaned up to this day, those people are very careful and selective as to who they hire. And very often, as we've seen in Cuesta, New Mexico, with a molly mine problem, these people were so egregious that they hired a real estate agent to run an inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectrometer that is used to monitor the poisonous and toxic metals that necessarily waft off all large heavy metal mining sites anywhere in the world. They have a realtor in Cuesta, New Mexico, allegedly monitoring and allegedly protecting the community. The correct background for such a person would be at least a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry at an absolute bare minimum, and a PhD would be needed to be retained and implemented to assess exactly what the spectrometer would be reporting, because they report 28 chemical elements. And 3 weeks ago, this same process was modified by a researcher in another part of the country for another reason to actually monitor 71 chemical elements from lithium to uranium that would be a danger to the community in Cuesta, New Mexico and the surrounding area. Now, this egregious situation is not at all uncommon. Constantly throughout this country, the health departments are using, in a sense, capitalism and capitalistic ideas to sidestep their responsibilities to the community. And quite frankly, things are not getting done.
Well, so let me take this time to kind of back us up a little bit. First of all, Greg mentioned that the Rocky Flats meeting, and as you know, I post those on the channel, so that will be available for you soon. This most recent meeting had a lot of interesting, like a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to splice that all on the screen, and you'll be able to find out more about what Greg was talking about with these hot particles and such there. As for the crowdfunding, yes, we are trying to get some money together to do our own independent testing, because as you know, me and Greg are not corporate shills at all. We don't even have an advertiser for the show, let alone, governments trying to pay us off to keep quiet. So, and the test is relatively cheap. It's well within the realm of something that we could finance relatively easy. And so if you're interested, I will put a link in the description of this video as to where you could go to maybe toss us a couple bones, outside of my Patreon, to really help us out with that. Let me back us up to the Rocky Flats debacle, though. When almost every time that you yourself talk about Rocky Flats, Greg, you bring up a long list of other sites around the country that have similar problems to Rocky Flats. Is this a symptom of procedures not being followed at almost every nuclear weapons production plant, or is it just simply showing us that there is no safe way to produce these triggers and these weapons, seeing how as almost every site where they have been made is heavily contaminated?
Well, yes. Yes to most of that, if not all of that. One of the things that I find troubling is the fact that we went into Afghanistan, or Iraq, pardon me, back in 1991 or whenever it was, and I believe the issue was brought up politically that the bad guy running the country, Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction, and that we, the West, needed to know about this. Well, they sent a contingent of people over there after twisting his arm before he wound up at the the short end of a rope around his neck, and we couldn't find any radiotoxic emissions. Well, put it this way. If you're making atomic bombs or anything like it, even a dirty bomb, and you're using something like plutonium, you are going to have emissions from your facility, just like Rocky Flats and Oak Ridge and Hanford and the Nevada test site and on and on and on, all of the above. And all of these sites, they all have a fingerprint that clearly makes it very clear that nuclear weapons have been manufactured there. This is no different when you go to Iraq. We didn't find anything, and people said, well, they moved the operation. This is a complete absurdity. You cannot possibly move a nuclear weapons manufacturing facility from point A to point B and remove every particle of plutonium or enriched uranium, fissionable materials that have wafted out your windows and out your ventilation stacks.
Even with the best ventilation systems, you're saying that these particles would still escape somehow, like traces of this radioactivity would still exist.
Yes, and that's in the absence of malicious worker conduct that I won't get into right now, because it's incredibly unbelievable that a worker would take a screwdriver and poke holes in a HEPA filter that was protecting the city of Denver, so he wouldn't have to change the filters, which are based on a hydrodynamic type of analysis that's very, very simple, that tells the filter bank operator when the filters are too clogged to do their work. Anyway, that's another whole
Yeah, that
story.
sounds like poor quality control amongst the employee. Like, supervision of the employees was severely lacking at Rocky Flats. And from what I hear, you have a bunch of really not highly, these weren't scientists, these weren't guys with PhDs in physics and chemistry, these were Joe Schmo from the local high school, who, you know, his first government job outside of high school with his high school diploma was going up there and doing work at Rocky Flats.
Yeah, that's correct, but it's not confined to Rocky Flats. Rocky Flats is not unique in this area of employment for people who are unqualified to do these kinds of jobs. But getting back to your original thing about plutonium, radiotoxic particles wafting off the sites, remember, if you live near a DOE site, and I'm not sure, I think there's at least 14, and I could be wrong on that, throughout the United States, all over, for military reasons, the policies of alleged control, responsibility, competence, and not being a charlatan, they're all the same, okay? It's the same company and all that. I have a letter I wrote to Dr. Glenn Seaborg asking for his assistance in pointing our direction, and this was about 20 years ago, as to where to look for the plutonium that is missing and unaccounted for from Rocky Flats. Now, I don't know how much he would have known about that number, but he would have been able to tell us something better than what he did.
Hold on a second. What do you mean missing or unaccounted for? You make it sound like one day a guy had a button, he had a stack of 15 buttons, and the next day there's only 14 there, and no one knows what happened to this 15th one. Isn't that not only a threat to worker safety, environmental safety, but also like a threat to the military safety of our country?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, you could go further than what your shocking response is. Now, let me get back to Glenn Seaborg, though. He actually took the responsibility to answer me, and he said, well, I don't know those numbers, which is probably a fairly legitimate answer. I don't condemn that guy for what he responded, but then he referred me to the Department of Energy's main office, headquarters in Washington, D.C., and their regular newsletters that were being produced at the time to supposedly address these issues, but not from Greg Marsh. Greg Marsh was a chemist, and he had some serious questions to ask in the letter, and we can put that up on the internet as well, and along with the other information we have concerning other aspects of this issue. Now, Glenn Seaborg referred us to this newsletter. Well, what is the newsletter? To quote a guy named Noam Chomsky, who is the newsletter? Well, the newsletter is created in Washington, D.C. by people with backgrounds in journalism. They know nothing about chemistry. They know nothing about epidemiology. They know nothing about the medicine of cancers, and on and on and on. And they produce the information that the Department of Energy itself gives them to produce and to publish, which is a pure case of the fox guarding the hen house. Except in this case, the fox isn't very smart.
Oh.
And he doesn't know what he's doing, and he's deceiving the people of this country.
Well, sounds like business as usual. I'm sure we could talk a little bit more about that. But let me ask you another question about the Rocky Flats. What is the big focus on the plutonium aspect of that? Because it seems like the plutonium itself is obviously decaying into other dangerous chemicals, and obviously there's more than just plutonium out there. I have heard americium, for instance, getting tossed around as something that might be out there. Uranium is another thing that comes up. Why is the focus on the plutonium aspect of what's out there?
Well, that's a good question. Plutonium-239 is a long-lived, 24,000-year half-life, very, very toxic substance. In fact, some people, including myself, will refer to it as one of the 5 most deadly substances known to exist. Now, if you had a button of pure plutonium, it would be nickel-plated because it's also pyrophoric. And I hope I don't forget addressing what the word pyrophoric means. But if you had a button of this and I handed it to you, foolishly, you would not die. Your hair wouldn't fall out or anything else. It might take 20 or 30 years for you to drop dead, or to get so many cancers that you wish you were dead. And that's how cancer works, so we want to avoid that really at all costs. Death by cancer, as my father suffered, was incredibly cruel. It's about the same as dying of dementia, which is incredibly cruel. Well, it's also very easy to track, relatively speaking, and there's no secrets about how you track it. That's pretty much known everywhere in the world where the stuff exists. And the ability to track it does cost money. And of course, the first thing politicians will say, well, where's the money going to come from? Well, my response would be, where's the money going to come from to treat all those astronomically expensive cancers in people's bodies? Not to mention the ones that are steamrollered into the ground. Now, about 30 years ago, there was a tragic case, of a little girl who grew up near the plant, and she had bone cancer from stuff that was probably wafting off the plant site. And at the age of 12, they said, well, okay, little girl, we think we can save your life if we chop your legs off. So they chopped her legs off, and she died anyway before the age of 13. I mean, if that isn't the motivation to find the money to do this kind of monitoring, I don't know what is. Now, to shift the presentation right now back to pyrophoricity. Now, what is that? That means that when plutonium, unprotected from oxygen in the air, is exposed to that oxygen in the air, it starts burning, and it gives off heat. Like, think of a charcoal briquette, if you want. Now, what is burning? Burning means that an atom of the combustible substance, in this case plutonium, that's on the surface of the plutonium, comes kinetically close enough to react with the oxygen atom in the air, and it combines with the oxygen, giving off a lot of heat, like a charcoal briquette, and it wafts off the block of plutonium, the plutonium substrate, the metal, and goes away downstream as a molecular-sized particle. We're talking nanoparticles here, really small ones that are way smaller than what it takes to go any which way but loose, according to the wind and other natural phenomena that are in place at the moment. Now, when that particle breaks off, another particle below it is exposed to the same oxygen, another molecule of oxygen, and it too does the same thing. Well, burning then is necessarily a system which creates very, very, very small particles that are very difficult to control. Now, in 1957, there was a fire at the plant that lasted a day. It burned out of control, and it was burning plutonium, and has created our first major body of plutonium that is muffed, missing and unaccounted for.
Okay.
All right. Now that hopefully is an answer to one of your earlier questions.
Yes.
Now, in 1969, they had an even bigger fire than the first one, which, by the way, was the largest and most expensive industrial fire in the history of industry, and that's probably around the world. Well, in 1969, there was a 3-day and 3-night fire that was burning out of control and making all sorts more plutonium that is missing and unaccounted for. And when I wrote Dr. Seaborg a letter to address this issue of how much could be missing and unaccounted for from a simple mass ratio control of how much plutonium was made versus how much can be accounted for in the waste repositories of our country and in the bombs themselves. Okay? If you add them all up, you don't get 100%. And the amount that's missing is what's called muffed, missing and unaccounted for. And it's common to every site, even the ones that would have been created in Iraq, when it was alleged that Saddam Hussein was making bombs. Now, a corollary to that thought is we know that the Israelis in Israel will not admit to making bombs, but we know they have made them in the past and are a nuclear power. Well, where are their footprints of the manufacture of their atomic bombs? And were they plutonium? Well, if they weren't plutonium, they were probably uranium-235. That'll kill you just as dead.
All right, Greg. Well, we'll cover this subject of Israel's nuclear testing another time because there's very interesting evidence that shows that they conducted a test in the late 70s. But a question I have for you is, do civilian power plants, the type used to power your city, are those as harmful as these nuclear weapons plants were? I don't seem to hear so much about plutonium radiation coming out of a nuclear power plant.
Basically, that's true. The real problem and issue with nuclear power plants is, and coal-fired power plants to a lesser extent, is what you do with the waste products after the energy or the power has already been generated. And of course, this is a really bad issue for nuclear power. And it's why it really isn't a renewable energy, because the cost of containing the waste radioactive decay products of plutonium-238, which has a much shorter half-life than plutonium-239, which is weapons grade, the storage for tens of thousands of years, actually hundreds of thousands of years, and their decay products, including things like americium, all of these are really, really toxic bad actors. They have to be protected forever. And when there's a spill of them, the responsible parties, called PRPs, potentially responsible parties, are in constant 24/7 denial. And we saw this at the northern Japanese power plant meltdown, which is still out of control. They're lying to us over and over again about its danger and hazard to the people. I saw a news report where a fisherman knowingly was fishing for radiotoxic fish who had absorbed these radiotoxic elements into their flesh and was selling them for people food. Well, he admitted that this was a horrible thing that he was doing, but he had no other way to make a living. And this is the case for most people in this world. They have no other way of making a living when something diabolical like that happens. The storage of these materials is an unbelievable cost to society that is not factored in adequately, if at all, in your utility bill. So these unbelievable costs and their storage requirements are being defrayed and delayed and ignored for the time being, because the cost of putting the things in the right place, if there is such a place, maybe deep in a mine that's not been geologically active for millions and millions of years, those costs are unbelievable, but they're not part of your utility bill. And we have alternatives that work so much better. Renewables, for example, wave power, tide power, and of course wind and solar, obviously. So, whatever.
So why aren't these more viable options being explored more? Why do we continue to build nuclear power plants and we still don't have big solar power plants or big geothermal energy plants? Why is it all nuclear seems to be the way everyone wants to go?
Well, we're stuck in a rut. And the people that make the decisions are in this rut with us. They put us in there whether we like it or not. And always can remember, the only difference between a grave and a rut is its length. Okay?
Okay.
Now, that being made whatever, we're very deeply entrenched. It took a long time for Mr. Peabody to go away with all of his dirty or even clean coal, if you're willing to be gullible to the point where you think a black lump of flaky, dirty, dusty coal can be labeled clean.
Yeah, ask China about how clean the coal is.
Right. And the pollution there is unbelievable, and India is no exception. So we have lots of examples of what we don't want to do to ourselves. However, we have to remember, when we export coal and they burn it upwind of us in Red China, then we're getting the influence as well.
Or even on a bigger note, you have to remember that when Fukushima leaks toxic waste into the water, we are the recipients of some of that.
Oh yes, big time. The water in the Pacific Ocean flows to the west onto our shores of California. It took a year for the radiotoxic debris that was floating on the surface of the Pacific to get to beaches in Oregon and California. Again, don't contact the local chambers of commerce for their presence or incidents on their beaches. You're not going to get it. And they feed the news to the local and national news media outlets. Getting back to the plutonium-238, which is a power plant grade plutonium, it has a much shorter half-life, and of course, being that it's always warm, in the presence of a thermocouple or a whole bunch of thermocouples, it's a great power source for a satellite that, or a space mission of some kind, like the one recently to Pluto, will need to power its onboard generators to generate the electricity to conduct the scientific robotically controlled experiments that are on board the space probe. And New Horizons is a very good example of a good use for plutonium-238. However, that is not without risk. The plutonium-238 used in those reactors originates on the surface of the Earth and is launched into space. If one of those launch vehicles fails to get into orbit, all of that plutonium is going to be somewhere back in our atmosphere or biosphere, and then we've got to deal with it. So there's even risks there when you blow it into space billions of kilometers from this planet.
So I guess the takeaway from all of this is that even a minuscule amount of plutonium reintroduced into our environment is terrible for us as human beings. There's not really a safe level of plutonium where you're going to be able to thrive in that environment. Any amount of this plutonium, whether it's weapons grade or reactor grade, is terrible for human beings and living things in general.
Yes, and the deceptions from that started with the detonation of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945, and were very adequately addressed and described and explained for the layman in Dr. Alice Stewart's book, The Woman Who Knew Too Much. She was a lady, a physician, not of humble origins. In fact, her parents were physicians as well. I think her mother in the book states that she was the second physician put in a for a female put into positions of incredible responsibility in England at the beginning of the 20th century. That's another story. Dr. Alice Stewart was very interested and spent some serious time even here in the Jefferson County, Colorado, just east of Denver area on a number of occasions. She loved to talk to people about these findings that she had made on the dangers of x-raying pregnant women in the 1950s. And the danger was that when the babies were born, many of them would have cancers and die young, before the age of 10 in many cases, I'm sure. Now, Dr. Stewart was a very strong proponent not only of controlling the x-raying of pregnant mothers, she was a very, very strong proponent of watching nuclear messes in this country, and the big one that's poisoned the Irish Sea between Ireland and England from the Sellafield nuclear power plants in central England. Those messes are still there, and they're going to be around for hundreds of thousands of more years.
And we'll go into some details. I think the next time we have Greg on, we're going to ask him the specifics of some of these nuclear accidents, because he is a treasure trove of knowledge. Like, a lot of people don't know what Sellafield was. And so next week, I feel like we'll delve into some of that. There's also an interesting story about some, I do believe it was cobalt that made its way down to Mexico that kind of came back to the United States in some unexpected and they would be hilarious ways almost if it wasn't talking about a highly radioactive material entering our country. I think while I have Greg for about 10 more minutes here, and where I'd like to end this episode is last week we talked about the doomsday clock, and it's been making the news because it's officially been moved back to 2 minutes to midnight. What I guess I want to get at is a lot of people don't know what the doomsday clock is, and they don't really know much about the group behind it, the Union of Concerned Scientists. As a concerned scientist yourself, not a member of said union, but a scientist with concerns, how reputable of an organization are these people? And do you think their justification of the doomsday clock being moved back to 2 minutes based on nuclear brinksmanship, do you think that's a valid point, or do you think that there's other problems that take precedence over that?
Well, that's a very good question. I look at it, they are my colleagues, and they have the facts, and they are not on anyone's payroll. And that's basically all you need to know. Now, they've been doing this doomsday clock, I believe it started in the late 40s. It hasn't gone away. The people have. The scientists have passed away. They get old and they die just like the rest of us. And of course, some of them, being scientists, are actually killed in their own laboratories from time to time, because laboratories are very dangerous places. Now, getting back to who's funding what and all of that, it's very cheap to have a doomsday clock and to publish it in appropriate places from time to time to remind people of the danger we're really in, basically annihilation of the human race, either slowly or very quickly. I put a great deal more faith in what they have to say than I would the weatherman and anything that comes from corporate America. Capitalism has a way of schmoozing over just about anything that's really, really bad for us, and they have no connections to the industries that would love to prostitute what they're telling us.
Yeah, because as we found out, organizations such as this one's really going to throw you guys for a loop. There's an organization called the Rocky Flats Stewardship Foundation. I'm pretty sure that's the name of a council, Stewardship Council, something along those lines. And you would think it's a group of people that are like the Rocky Flats Right to Know people that are actually concerned with what goes on out there at Rocky Flats, until you get to investigate them a little bit more and you find out they're simply just corporate shills that did the bare minimum, went out there with Geiger counters, which won't pick up plutonium, and waved them around in the air and said, look, the Geiger counters don't detect anything, so it's got to be safe. And instead of being stewards of this land, they seem more interested in selling it out to corporate interests such as a nature refuge or a tollway. And I hope to God if they open up that tollway, folks, you guys drive as fast as you can down it, because you're going to be taking in alpha particles the whole damn time you're on the road. And I can attest that when we went to Chernobyl and we got to the Red Forest, that guy floored the van. The Geiger counter on the floor was just screaming at us the entire time we're speeding 65 miles an hour through this road. I hope you guys like that, because that's what we're looking at here if this stewardship council allows it to open up. And the sad thing is this is just one organization of probably hundreds in this country that come across as representing the interest of the people on paper, but under the surface really are just out to appease the corporations and to make the corporations feel less liable for the damages out there. If the Stewardship Council says it's fine out there, it's up to the people to prove that it's not fine. We don't have this, we're assuming the corporation is innocent until individual people that have to do it with their own money, which stifles the attempts, because your average person's not rich. Even organizations such as Rocky Flats Right to Know have a limited amount of money. And when you have a corporate entity such as the Stewardship Council saying it's safe out there, it's up to organizations like us to prove that it's not. And unfortunately, this innocent till proven guilty when it comes to the corporations, if the corporations put a sound clip out there saying it's safe, we have to come up with the smoking gun ourselves. And the goalposts keep getting moved. It's not enough to find plutonium out there. You have to find plutonium that's specifically chemically traced to coming from Rocky Flats, or they will not accept it.
That's true. You covered a number of areas there that are really important. Several weeks ago, we uploaded a YouTube on our channel of VDoc Pro channel on YouTube, and we addressed the issue of corporate charlatanism. We probably didn't get into it as deep as we need to, and if you'd like to know more about corporate charlatanism and the charlatans that they employ to create those fake news stories of safety around nuclear plants, please let us know. Give us a heads up or whatever you want us to cover in that general genre, because you're not going to get it from them. CBS News is never going to be a source of what we will tell you about that. Now, the big problem that I see is not just a small relatively amount of money, a couple $1 million from a giant developer advertising or implying that the area is just fine. They don't really do that. What they do is they buy the property dirt cheap, they lie about its contamination, and then they build really expensive homes that they sell to suckers and stupid rich people, SRPs. Now, the SRPs are immune to technological knowledge that they need to have just to survive. But they buy these properties. These are size 10 homes on size 7 lots, side by side, and that are now surrounding the Rocky Flats plant downwind of the original site. If they would build them upwind, they'd be on public property and they couldn't develop them. So they're in the worst possible places, and they're also downhill, and where all the plutonium that wafted off the plant from accidents and fires and normal day-to-day activities, which were probably the biggest total source, the low-level day-to-day emissions from the plant. Well, what do you have? You go up there today, and you see, I guess, hundreds, if not 1,000 or so, such homes. They're not cheap, but they will be, and you can move to Colorado and buy one when the people of our society really learn what the messages of our YouTubes and podcasts really are. Anybody can do that, and eventually it will happen. It's pretty much inevitable.
Yeah, it's to your own interest, really. But I don't think, Greg, your average person that's buying a house even really thinks that plutonium contamination is something they even need to worry about. I think your average home buyer assumes that where their house is at has been surveyed and has been cleared for this is a safe area to live. I don't think people, they're looking at the house, knocking on the walls, making sure it's going to stand up, making sure it's got a solid foundation, maybe even taking into account some environmental factors. But plutonium is certainly, your average person is not thinking about that. Is that something that perhaps the real estate industry should be on?
You're absolutely right. But it's chronic and it's long-term deception. For example, I want to draw a metaphor here. When people go to a town to move their lives to a new location because of work or whatever, and they have children, they want to know what the quality of the education is that their children are going to get in the nearby school. Well, what do? They look at the funding of the school and the quality of the teachers and things that are external and due to common knowledge logic. Okay, obviously, if you're going to move into, say, Detroit or a horrible place like Dayton, Ohio, and just about any other place, really, I shouldn't single those two out, people will ask questions. Well, how are the teachers? How is the school? What's the funding? What are my taxes for supporting these schools? Well, this imparts a false sense of security because those informations are very easy to get. They're published as public information from the expenditure of taxpayers' dollars. What they should be asking is, what is the indoor air quality of the school? How will my child be protected from lead and asbestos that contaminates every school building in America that was built before about 1980 that hasn't been adequately remediated? Well, okay, let's say it was built in 1965, as so many were, when they were building lots and lots of schools for the baby boomers of Second World War and the Korean War. All right, are they asking about asbestos? And the answer is no. Well, asking about asbestos in the school is pretty much the same as asking about plutonium at the new Stanley Lake High School, downwind of the Rocky Flats plant, right near Stanley Lake, which is contaminated with plutonium itself and is a drinking water supply for a number of communities around the plant, including Broomfield, Colorado. Now, why aren't people asking these questions? Well, they're smoothed over. They're smoothed over by corporate shills who run ads for let's build and sell high-priced and moderately priced homes right over the hill from the Rocky Flats plant's former location, which is still there with all the poison. And some of the poisons in some of the areas were so bad they couldn't move them. Well, all these homes, what is the signal here? They don't need to run an ad saying it's safe to run. They've found a lot of stupid rich people to buy these houses in the first place. And if you go up there today, there are people there going to school, they're sending their kids to school, they're carrying their children to school on highways and byways that they put in to accommodate and service the houses that they built. So what's the problem here? Well, there's a lot of big problems, and when they come to light, the value of those properties is going to plummet because nobody will buy them. It'll be suddenly Detroit, Michigan all over again.
And this isn't a problem that you can just easily go in and clean up. Plutonium has an extremely long half-life. It's extremely hazardous to handle. Your average construction crew is not even remotely equipped or prepared to remove plutonium from an area. So once these houses are found to be irreversibly contaminated, that's all she wrote, folks. You may as well just blow them up, because at that point no one's going to want to live in these contaminated homes.
Well, we don't want to blow them up upwind of Denver, Colorado.
That's right.
But basically your message is correct. So for you people that aren't astute, you'll be able to buy a very cheap home in a place with a lot of risks that you don't want.
And I have a feeling, and we don't have a whole lot of time left, and maybe this is something we can address next time, but you can confirm with a simple yes or no. I have a feeling that around the arsenal, which produced chemical weapons among other things, I have a feeling that there's a very similar problem with the houses being built in that area, where they're being built on land contaminated by arsenic, cyanide, etc.
Okay, now the arsenal, what is the arsenal? The arsenal means the kilometers due east, downwind, of the Rocky Flats plant. And it's one of 4 major polluting sources in the major quadrants that make up the greater Denver area that, once again, the Chamber of Commerce will never talk about.
No.
Not in 1,000 years. Well, the arsenal was a repository for chemical weapons since it opened in 1942. They were a manufacturing site used by a company called Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, the one in I think that's in the Netherlands, Holland. Anyway, If that doesn't make your skin crawl, then maybe Dow Chemical will, and those are the people that founded the Rocky Flats plant. In any event, you all out there will know that these horrendous names are big red flags waving to anybody that wants to live nearby. The arsenal has been built for decades. When I was monitoring chemist out there on a small contract, which was subsequently defunded for political reasons and not for the scientific validity that it was not complying with, because there was no scientific validity to defunding the contracts I was working under. It had been known for at least a decade before the early 80s that in fact there were a lot of off-site streams of underground aquifers and rivers and streams and so forth coming from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal to residential area to the north of what's called the North Plants area. That would include Basin F, the most heinous soup of uncontrolled, unmonitored poison that could leak off any contaminated site. The EPA's hazardous waste manager, Dr. Can't think of his name right now, labeled it way back then as the most toxic square kilometer or something in America.
Wow. And America's pretty polluted, so for someone to come out and saying that the amount to clean that up is going to be so astronomical that it's almost just going to never happen because of the dangers of cleaning all that up. And we'll get into more of that next week. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I'd like to thank Greg Marsh here for talking to us for an hour and kind of answering some of our questions. If you have any questions for Mr. Marsh, feel free to leave them in the comments below or contact me directly via our Facebook page, my Instagram account. Any of those places are good ways to contact us with questions. Also, if you're interested in crowdfunding our independent evaluation of the high volume air coming out of the former plant, you can donate down below. Have a link to a Kickstarter down there, and you can definitely be assured that our analysis is not tainted by any corporate money. Otherwise, we wouldn't be asking for you folks to fund it. We would be asking for Dow Chemical to fund it so we could give you some fraudulent result. So yeah, thanks for joining us on the Herald of the Endtimes Apocalypse Hour. It's been great talking with you. I really look forward to getting with you next week, and we'll more than likely have Mr. Greg Marsh on next week's episode as well, as we continue to get a chemist's opinion about the contamination that we face in our world.
Feel free to solicit questions.
Yeah, any questions you guys have, let me know. I definitely would like to have more content on the show. And if there's a topic you'd like to hear us cover that you feel is relevant, certainly shoot me a suggestion. We're always looking for listener feedback on this show, and we value the listeners. Thanks so much for joining us. Until we meet again, happy survival.